Hi, I'm Zera, host of the Moxie OT podcast. Did you know researchers have estimated the knowledge translation gap in healthcare is 17 years? First, let's talk about what is knowledge translation. Knowledge translation is how we close this gap from knowledge of the best evidence to evidence-based practice. So that leads us to the next question. How do we define evidence-based practice? Evidence-based practice is a blend of your clinical expertise, integrating the evidence, and considering the client's preferences, beliefs, and values. But why is evidence-based practice important? Using evidence-based practice enables us to provide the most beneficial interventions for our clients. It helps us to educate our clients on our decision-making processes, but also allows us the room to tailor our interventions to our clients' needs. Occupational therapists have identified 5 steps to integrate the evidence into practice. The first is identifying the question based on your clinical experiences. The second is collecting relevant evidence from the literature. The third is evaluating the evidence you have found to determine the best evidence. Fourth is implementing your research findings in collaboration with the client. And finally, evaluate if the evidence provided the expected outcomes. When put simply like this, evidence-based practice sounds easy enough, but as practitioners, we know that it can be a challenging process. Finding the time and resources to explore the evidence can feel next to impossible when keeping up with today's productivity standards. Many clinicians don't have access to library databases, which can add to the challenge. Sometimes organizational expectations or structures don't support the change required to implement new evidence. These are just a few of the challenges OT practitioners face. I'm sure you can think of many more challenges you face on a day-to-day basis. I wanted to share a few strategies I have found helpful when implementing evidence-based practice. Let's go through the steps together. The first step is identifying the research question, which seems straightforward, but we might have difficulty even identifying a need for a question. We may be providing therapy the way our fieldwork supervisors demonstrated for us, or the way we learned in school many years ago. It might be difficult to identify that there are more appropriate interventions or assessments for our clients. If you recognize this might be a barrier you're facing, you might create a research question based on a common or typical diagnosis you work with. For example, when I went back to school, I asked, what are the most appropriate interventions for adults with an acquired brain injury and executive function deficits? The next step, collecting the appropriate research, is likely the most difficult for many OT practitioners. I already identified time and access to the evidence as large barriers to this step. The OT community has created so many great resources to help OTs access the evidence. That's why we created the Moxie OT podcast. On our website, we provide links to articles, books, and CEUs on all of the topics we discuss. There are lots of other great resources out there to support OTs, like the OT Potential podcast, the Rehab Measures website, and the Stroke Engine website. Another favorite tip of mine is to create a journal club at your workplace. Take turns each month selecting an article and discuss as a group the findings and key takeaways. I know being able to discuss what I read with others helps me feel more confident that I've understood the content. The next step ties right in, which is evaluating the findings to determine what is the best evidence. This can feel quite overwhelming. Using many of the strategies I just discussed can be helpful in this evaluation process as well. Sharing ideas with our colleagues in a journal club can help us synthesize the information and suss out what are the key takeaways. You might also compare your findings with those of our guests on the Moxie OT podcast or other resources. The fourth step is implementing the evidence using shared decision-making. This is important. I think sometimes we end up on one end of the spectrum or the other. We get so client-centered we let the client direct the therapy, or we get so evidence-based we apply evidence-based interventions without input from the client. Using evidence-based practice is part of the art and science we use to describe OT. A great example from my own practice is when I was working in outpatient day rehab. I had a client who was rehabilitating from a stroke and was demonstrating excellent return in her impaired upper extremity. However, she continued to neglect that upper extremity, and she was an excellent candidate for modified constraint-induced movement therapy. But when discussing the options to improve her upper extremity function, the client was very uncomfortable with the CIMT protocol. So together we chose to use task-specific training, another excellent evidence-based intervention. The final step is evaluating the results. This can be an easy step to skip. We get so busy in our day-to-day experiences in the clinic, we forget to step back and examine our results. If your question was regarding an intervention, examine your outcome measures. Did the client make the changes you expected? This is a good moment to stop and express the importance of using outcome measures. Even when applying interventions we're very familiar with, we need to be able to assess the progress of our clients. Consider what is the best outcome measure to capture your client's progress. Your research question might have explored many other topics beyond interventions. You might have explored assessments that are appropriate for your client's diagnoses or impairments, or you might have explored expected outcomes of your clients with that diagnosis. Make sure you take a moment and evaluate if your findings helped you complete your goal. What's a topic you'd like to explore further? Make a plan to start gathering your evidence today. As you start this process, consider using the Moxie OT podcast as a resource. At the Moxie OT podcast, we have episodes exploring a range of evidence-based topics, from pediatric interventions to assessments to things you never thought about like therapeutic drumming. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or watch our videos from our website. What questions do you plan to explore first? Let us know in the comments.